What it do, YouTube? I'm waking up very late at night. Just jumped out of bed because this is a video, a topic that I wanted to talk about. And, I think it's important that we not let our ancestors go forgotten. I'm going to talk about a slave ship revolt. Now, you can file this one under Black history and the history of Black resistance to white oppression. You know about one slave ship revolt, and that was the Amistad. They made a movie about it, but there were many slave ship revolts. And, I got to get a little hyped up when I talk about this, because this brother died very pathetically, but at the same time, he was a man's man. He was a bold, courageous, strong black man. He was a black king from Madagascar, an island that we sometimes forget about when we talk about Africa. His name was Masavana, King Masavana, Masavana. And King Masavana was one day, as the history of niggerism goes, some niggas invited him out to the forest or whatever in southern Madagascar. They claimed they wanted to talk to him or give him a gift or something. And there were many, 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 probably hundreds of men. They seized him and they seized all his men. They took his gold. They took his tribal ornaments that he had. And these were his own people, really. And they sold him to the white South Africans at the time. And they put him and his men on boats. But, he was a smart brother. There was a very extremely brutally high casualty rate going on among slaves in the bottom of slave boats. A lot of them were dying. And at the time, the South Africans, the white South Africans, they were scarce in resources. They only had like one or two boats. I think just one. And this boat was going back and forth between Madagascar and South Africa, taking blacks like crazy. And a lot of the blacks on the boat, specifically the men and women, were dying. The children actually did better. But the men and women were dying. So when they put Masavana and his 30-some-odd men on this boat, in order to, actually make it to South Africa so they could put these niggers to work, they would bring a certain number of them up to the top of the ship and let them breathe the air, let them, walk around, stretch their bones out. Well, in the process of Masavana being brought up continually, he would kind of scope things out. Now, he would kind of look things over. He wanted to know how big the ship was, how many floors it had, how wide it was, where everything was. So one day, they went down to the bottom of the ship and got him and brought him all the way up to the top of the ship, and they brought 36 of his men. And the white South Africans had guns, and, they was big-headed, arrogant white boys, and they pretty much thought, these are some very funny-looking niggers, and, they're very tribal. They got their little spears and stuff, and as a matter of fact, the white boys had bought some of their spears from other South Africans and other Africans in Madagascar. And they thought it would be a unique thing to give these men their spears. And for reasons that are still unexplainable to this very day, they decided to let these men sharpen their own spears. Now, one day, Masavana, communicating with his men, with hand and eye signals, said, if they're going to be stupid enough to give us our spears, they must have it in their head that we want to be slaves. Masavana directed his men to raise up like men and beat the shit out these white boys. Over the course of really just, I think it was maybe 15 to 30 minutes, Masavana and his men on a slave boat headed from Madagascar to South Africa killed nearly 40 white South African slave captors on the ship. The only one who survived was the captain and 6 other guys, and they forced him down into the bottom of the ship. The only reason he stayed alive was because Masavana didn't want to lose any more men, and the captain was in the bottom of the ship with 6 of his men. The only thing was they only had a limited amount of guns and a few pieces of ammunition. And back then, this was when you still had to, you had to use a musket. So Masavana couldn't get him completely. But what ended up happening was that when they got to, Masavana went to the bottom of the ship, and he snatched up one of them white boys who knew how to sail the ship and told him, "Take me back to Madagascar. Take us back." And the white dude, he lied, and he said he was going to take him back. But truthfully, he went ahead and directed the ship towards South Africa. Masavana, upon them getting close to the coastline, he knew that he wasn't in Madagascar because he looked up and he seen the birds. There were certain type of birds that were native to South Africa that wasn't native to Madagascar. He said, "These don't look like the type of birds that you catch on the beach where I'm from. You lied to us. You didn't take us back to Madagascar." But he didn't know for sure. So they took the little bitty small sailboats on side of the ship, and he got some of his men to sail. They were parked about a mile or so off the coast. It probably wasn't even that. It was probably just like 500 feet. But I think it was somewhere in the range of half a mile, a couple thousand feet. And he got the men to sail the boat onto the coastline. And basically, what they were supposed to do is that if they was in Madagascar, the men were ordered to set 6 fires on the beach. If they wasn't in Madagascar, he wasn't going to hear from them. And when they got on the beach, the captain of the ship had wrote a letter, put it in a bottle, and check this out. He threw the bottle, the white man threw the bottle out the side of the boat. And guess who picked it up on the south beach of South Africa? There was a black female, picked the goddamn letter in a bottle up, and it was a distress letter. She took it to the white folks, so they pretty much expected that there was a rebel mutiny that had happened on the ship. And they knew that the first second that they seen some niggas off of a ship, come onto land, attack them. So they attacked Masavana's men. And, they finally went out there and seized him and his remaining men off the ship. And it was one of these classical cases, very, very similar to the Amistad. They put him on trial, but he, just like the brother from the Amistad, this man was a king. He wasn't no dummy. He was not stupid. He knew how to defend himself. And he actually ended up winning the trial. And what ended up happening was that when the ship was docked off the coast of South Africa, it was actually several days that passed. Because he didn't have anybody on the ship who could sell it back to Madagascar. And plus, it wasn't no food on the ship. He was stuck between a rock and a hard place. But what ended up happening was that the ship hit a whole lot of rocks. It got hit by a whole lot of wind. And it was like the only slave ship at the time. The ship ended up being destroyed. And they took Masavana's men after he won the trial. They returned most of his men back to Madagascar. But with him being a king, they never returned him back. They shipped him off to a small island where he starved and died. And see, this is the reason why I say we have to remember brothers like this. Because if I could talk to his ancestral spirit, I would tell him that your resistance and your mutiny was not in vain. Even more important than you raising up and killing them 30-some white boys was the fact that you kept that ship off course or offshore so long that it wound up being destroyed. And it was never used again to bring another slave from Madagascar to South Africa. He died on that island of starvation and hunger. He was isolated on that island. They just let him die, starved to death. But his death ultimately wasn't in vain. And as I say, what ended up happening was that, as you could pretty much expect, The elite from North Europe came all the way down because they wanted to see exactly how the hell did a nigger, lead a slave revolt on a ship, kill 30-some white men, and we dealing with the only ship we had that was bringing us a lot of money from Madagascar to South Africa is now gone. And basically they found out that the white South African system was just mired in corruption, and they brought it to an end. And all of that would not have happened had not it been for the great sacrifice of Brother Masavana and his men. It's your boy, Mr. Dark and Not So Lovely. Look Masavana up. King Masavana, Madagascar, Masavana. Holla.